Support Name Explain on Patreon for ad-free videos, exclusive podcasts and blog posts, and to help choose what names get explained. Click the link in the description. Suriname might possibly be my favourite country name, and that's for one simple reason. Completely within the name of Suriname is the word of name unto itself, and you know how much I love names. Though, has the etymology of Suriname actually got anything to do with the noun of names, or is it just a big coincidence? Well, this name seems to be actually of native origins, believed to come from a tribe of people who once lived in this land, those being called the Suriname. However, we seem to know very little about these guys, as even by the 16th century, when European migration was starting to take place, the Suriname had been disbanded, so where their name came from we don't seem to be too sure. What we seem to be sure about, however, is that this tribe's name got attached to the Suriname River, which was what the country was then named after. So it's a nation named after a river named after a tribe. However, this doesn't really explain the name part of the name now, does it? The tribe were called the Suriname, so how did that become Suriname? Well, the suffix seems to actually be somewhat common in the nation. In example, there's also a river called the Copenhagen River. It seems to come from one of Suriname's native tongues and means river mouth. So the fact that the tribe's name ended with an N, and the fact that they had this established suffix in their language already meant that they could put together these two words to create the word name in English, despite the fact it has nothing to do with names. This means that this name, featuring the word name, is little more than a coincidence, but a fun one nonetheless. Suriname is more than just a fun sounding name, however. The nation lies in the north of South America, and despite being on the continent, it is seen by many as a Caribbean nation, having many ties with the island nations in that sea. It is also the smallest nation on the continent in terms of geographic size and population. It is just over 163,000 square kilometers in size, and has a population of just over 540,000. Yes, I do know that the French Guiana does have a smaller population, but that's an overseas part of France and not its own nation, so shush. Do not be deceived, however, by this small landmass and population, as despite these tiny stats, the nation of Suriname has masses of something else entirely: languages. Suriname is a goldmine for language lovers like myself and yourself. In a continent dominated by Spanish and Portuguese, this tiny slice of South America bucks the trend entirely. Of course, it's also worth mentioning that while we are focusing on Suriname here, there are a huge variety of languages spoken all across South America. It's far more than just Spanish and Portuguese as you may think at first. Back to Suriname, however, and what I also find fascinating about this nation's languages is the huge variety of ways in which these languages arrived in the country. Many of these languages are native to the land and have been there for thousands of years, while many have been brought over to the nation via immigration and colonization, including the nation's surprising official language. And there's even languages that have formed in relatively more recent years, thanks to other languages intermixing with one another. As I mentioned, this part of the world is an incredible place for language variety. Wikipedia lists 23 different languages being spoken in this tiny area. While a few of them are the usual suspects, some listed here really took me off guard. I'm in no way surprised to see the likes of Spanish, Portuguese, French and English are spoken here. But Javanese? How did a language from the other side of the Pacific Ocean end up here? Today I just want to highlight these languages, find out what exactly they are, and how they arrived in the land. The first languages here were of course the many native tongues of the area. The land that makes up modern Suriname has been inhabited since 3000 BC, way before Europeans ever touched these shores. It's unsurprising that in this huge amount of time a variety of languages emerged. In 3000 BC, unsurprisingly, they didn't care too much for borders like we do. This means that many of these languages are not only spoken in Suriname, but in the neighbouring nations too. And there's a huge difference in amounts of speakers for many of these tongues. Some are spoken by thousands, while others just a handful. Take the language of Creole in example. This is a language spoken by a small hunter-gatherer tribe of people with the same name that reside within the nation of Suriname. One estimate says there are just 40 speakers of the language left to this day. This is an incredibly endangered language within the nation. The language of Arawak, also known as Lokono, isn't as diminished thankfully, though still only has roughly 2,000 or so native speakers. The speakers of this language not only reside in Suriname, but other places on South America's northern coast like Guyana, French Guiana and Venezuela too. It's this language where the previously mentioned suffix meaning river mouth comes from, meaning these guys are the ones to blame as to why Suriname has the word name in its name. This is a language that was also once spoken natively on some of the islands of the Caribbean Sea, tying Suriname to the Caribbean Sea even more so. Likewise, there's also the Carib language of the Carib/Kalina people. This is a language spoken across these same countries too, and even down into Brazil as well. If you didn't happen to realize, it's this language and its native speakers as to what the Caribbean Sea is named after. There's thought to be between 7,000 to 10,000 speakers of this tongue, so once again more than previous languages, but still not too many. The Sikiana language, however, is not as fortunate. Wikipedia claims that in a 2001 count, there were just 33 speakers of the language in Brazil and 15 in Suriname. This is another extremely endangered tongue. Tirio likewise is spoken between just Suriname and Brazil too, by just around 1,000 speakers. The Waiwai language is spoken primarily in Brazil with a few hundred or so in Suriname and Guyana. The most widely spoken of these indigenous languages, however, is Raralo, spoken by roughly 20,000 across Suriname, Guyana and Venezuela. What's also interesting about this one is it doesn't seem to be related to any of the other Native American languages. Guyana, however, has just around 800 speakers across South America. If you weren't keeping track of all those, that's 8 native languages spoken in Suriname alone. Though despite these aforementioned languages being present in the land for thousands of years, none of them are the nation's official language. So, what is? Well, this is a key example of Suriname breaking away from the conventions of the rest of South America. The majority of South America either has Spanish as its official language or Portuguese in Brazil primarily. Suriname, on the other hand, has Dutch. Yep, the language of all things tulips and clogs has found itself at home all the way across the Atlantic. All official business, media and education in the land is conversed in Dutch. Suriname is only one of 3 countries to have Dutch as its official language, the other 2 being the Netherlands itself and Belgium. This is of course a remnant of the Netherlands' former large world empire. In 1650, Suriname was actually under English rule. It was only 17 years after this, however, in 1667, that the Dutch seized this land from England and claimed it for themselves. Suriname would stay under Dutch rule from 1667 all the way until 1975, when it was finally made independent from the Netherlands. This was more than enough time for the Dutch language to become entrenched in the land as its official language. Surinamese Dutch has even gone on to become its own kind of thing. It's not incredibly different to the Dutch spoken in Europe, however. From what I can gather, a Dutch speaker from Suriname and a Dutch speaker from the Netherlands could understand each other pretty easily. There are other exported tongues in the nation, but we'll cover those in a moment. Right now, however, I want to focus on the many Creole languages that have come into being in the nation. Creole languages are languages that primarily developed across the Americas in the 17th and 18th century. They came into being out of necessity, when people from various backgrounds were put together and didn't speak the same language. Perhaps the best example of a Creole is the French-inspired Creole of Haiti, which has gone on to become one of the nation's official languages. There are a few Creoles that have emerged from Suriname, the most widely spoken of these, however, being Slanan Tongo, known as just Slanan for short. This is an English-based Creole, which is also influenced by the likes of Dutch, Portuguese, and some other West African tongues. Despite Dutch being the nation's official language, Slanan is spoken way more widely and is considered the nation's lingua franca. Apparently, roughly 80% of the nation's population speak this tongue. From what I can gather, it seems to be the language of the people, while Dutch is still reserved for the elite. While Slanan has some respect, it's not taught in school and has no official status, despite being so widely spoken. If you happen to be watching from Suriname, I'd love to know what the relationship between Dutch and Slanan is like in reality, as all I can really do is gather facts from the internet and books. And for those interested in the name of this language, it simply means Surinamese tongue. While Slanan Tongo is the most popular Creole in the nation, it's not the only one. And what's interesting about these other Creoles is that they're also the languages of Maroon people. Maroon people are something I didn't know all too much about, however, but they're deeply fascinating. Maroons are descendants of African slaves in the Americas who fled and formed settlements away from the society of their slavers. Many of them actually went on to live with natives of the land, leading to populations of people of African descent living lives like natives of America. This happened all across the Americas, leading to Creole languages being created from the native languages and whatever tongues these escaped slaves spoke. The most commonly spoken of these in Suriname is the Nunjuka language, also called Ukan and Eastern Maroon. Just shy of 70,000 people speak this tongue across Suriname and French Guiana. The fellow Creole language of Quinti is closely related, but has far less speakers, just a few hundred or so. Then there's also the Creole Maroon language of Suriname, with a whopping 90,000 speakers. This tongue seems to have a stronger African influence than others. The Matawai tribe of Suriname speak a variation of this language, however their numbers stand at just 70,000 or so. Finally, there's the language of the Palamakan people, who are another Maroon tribe living in Suriname. This language has a few thousand speakers too, and from what I've read, is pretty similar to the very popular Slanan. Despite this large variety of Creole languages, it seems that they are all somewhat mutually legible with one another. What probably hasn't been as legible, however, is my pronunciation of some of these language names. Unfortunately, it's pretty hard to find the correct pronunciation for some of these, so apologies once again on that front. Anyway, while that's all the Creoles, there are even more languages spoken here. That's with tongues that have been exported from other parts of the world. While Dutch is the largest example of this, there are a few others. Somehow a handful of Asian languages have made themselves at home here. One has even become something of its own language unto itself, that being Suriname Hindustani. This is an Indian language that was heavily inspired and changed by various other languages spoken in Suriname. Though, how did an Indo-Aryan language come into existence in South America? Well, this once again dates back to the time in which the Netherlands ruled this part of the world. It wasn't only South America they had land in, however, as they had land in India too. When the Dutch needed labour and workers in Suriname, they sent people from India to Suriname. It was these Indian workers who interacted with people in Suriname as the house Suriname Hindustani was born. Now there are thought to be around 150,000 speakers of the tongue. It wasn't only India the Dutch had land in, however. A very similar situation happened in Indonesia too, with the Dutch taking people from their land in Indonesia to work in Suriname. This is how Javanese ended up in the land too, with there being around 100,000 people of Javanese descent in Suriname to this day. Chinese has also found its way into Suriname too, with Chinese migrants coming over to the land in the 19th century. And of course we have the aforementioned usual suspects of Spanish, Portuguese, French and English being spoken in the country too. Those first three are spoken here because they're the three main languages of South America, and English is spoken there too simply because English gets pretty much everywhere, though there are old English ties in the land too. Whether it be languages spoken in the land for thousands of years, migrant tongues that have made themselves at home, or even brand new Creoles being created out of necessity and becoming widely spoken, Suriname seems to have it all and really is a linguistic treasure trove. Let's bring this all back, however, to where this video begun, with the name of Suriname. What is this nation even called in all these languages? Well, luckily, it seems that all these languages use a name somewhat similar to Suriname, which makes things much easier, I imagine. Suriname was suggested by John Bastian, and thanks to their suggestion, they will now be honoured as Name Explained's patron saint of Suriname. Do you have a good idea for somewhere that's name could be covered in a Name Explained video? If so, then please consider donating on Patreon. Just $1 a month helps keep the channel running and earns you a weekly chance to suggest somewhere to be turned into a video, and you too could be a Name Explained Patreon saint. Thank you to all my patrons who support Name Explain on a monthly basis. Patreon is vital to Name Explain, and donating just $2 a month allows you to enjoy ad-free videos and bonus Patreon-exclusive content. It also allows you to help choose what names get explained in upcoming videos, and gets your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you so much for all the support you guys give Name Explain. Thank you so much for reaching the end of the video. Check out another video and subscribe to stay in the loop on all things Name Explain. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram where I'm Name Explain YT, and also join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain, both of which will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.